Hello, night owls and history enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of Insomnia History. Today's video will take us deep into the fascinating world of medieval warfare, exploring how armies were actually raised, organized, and transformed throughout the Middle Ages. Imagine you're a king in medieval Europe. A rival monarch has just invaded your territory. You need an army, and you need it fast. But there's no standing military waiting at your command. No recruitment offices, no reserves to call upon. How exactly do you assemble thousands of fighting men in an age without modern communication or transportation? The answer lies in feudalism, the social and political system that defined medieval Europe for nearly 1,000 years. At its core, feudalism was a military institution disguised as a social hierarchy. When William the Conqueror distributed English lands to his Norman followers after 1066, he wasn't simply rewarding loyal friends. He was establishing a network of military obligations that would serve as the backbone of his new kingdom's defense. Land was power in medieval Europe, but it came with strict conditions. Every noble who received land from the king became a tenant-in-chief, owing military service in return for their holdings. These greater lords then subdivided their territories among lesser nobles, who owed military service to them in turn. This cascade of obligations created a pyramid of military responsibility that could be activated when needed. The fundamental military unit in this system was the knight's fee, or fief. A typical knight's fee consisted of enough land to support a single armored horseman and his equipment. Larger vassals might owe dozens or even hundreds of knights, while a minor landholder might owe only partial service, perhaps joining with others to equip a single warrior. The system was remarkably standardized, creating a predictable framework for military mobilization. When a king needed to raise an army, he would issue a summons known as the arrière-ban to his direct vassals. These nobles were required to bring their promised contingent of knights or pay a tax called scutage as an alternative. Scutage, derived from the Latin word for shield, allowed military obligations to be converted into cash payments. This money could then be used to hire professional soldiers, often more effective than reluctant feudal levies. However, feudal service was strictly time-limited. Most vassals were obligated to serve just 40 days per year, an arrangement that severely restricted military campaigns. This time limit helps explain why medieval warfare often consisted of brief campaigns, punctuated by long periods of inactivity. More extended service required payment, and medieval kings frequently lacked the funds to maintain armies in the field for prolonged periods. The Norman system that arrived in England represented perhaps the most organized version of feudal military service in Europe. William's Domesday Book of 1086 meticulously recorded land holdings and corresponding military obligations. This exceptional administrative efficiency allowed Norman and later Plantagenet kings to rapidly mobilize armies of several thousand knights when needed. But knights alone did not make an army. The mounted, heavily armored warrior might have been the prestige unit of medieval forces, but they formed only a small percentage of any significant field army. Most medieval armies consisted primarily of foot soldiers, archers, and various support personnel who fell outside the strict feudal hierarchy of knightly service. To supplement the limited numbers of feudal knights, medieval rulers employed a system called the fard in England, or the arrière-ban in France. This was essentially a selective draft that required able-bodied freemen to serve as infantry in times of emergency. Each locality had to provide a certain number of men, usually equipped at their own or their community's expense. The quality of these troops varied enormously depending on their wealth, experience, and motivation. Peasants, who formed the vast majority of the medieval population, were generally not expected to fight unless defending their immediate locality. When they did serve, They typically formed disorganized militia forces with minimal training and equipment. A wealthy peasant might possess a spear and perhaps a padded jacket. Poorer recruits might have nothing more than farming implements repurposed as weapons. The church, despite its nominal separation from secular affairs, was deeply integrated into the feudal military system. Bishops and abbots were often major landholders who owed considerable military service to their kings. Though forbidden from personally shedding blood, these clerical lords fulfilled their obligations by sending knights from their estates. Some church officials also maintained armed retinues for defense purposes that could be contributed to royal armies. By the 12th century, limitations of the feudal levy system had become increasingly apparent. Feudal armies were difficult to control, often unreliable, and severely constrained by their service terms. As a result, medieval rulers gradually shifted toward paid, professional forces. This transition accelerated as monetary economies developed, allowing kings to collect taxes rather than direct service from their subjects. The Crusades served as a catalyst for this military evolution. European armies operating thousands of miles from home could not rely on traditional feudal service. Instead, they developed sophisticated payment systems, longer enlistment terms, and more professional command structures. These innovations gradually filtered back to domestic European warfare, particularly in areas where crusading traditions were strong. Mercenaries became increasingly important in medieval warfare from the 12th century onward. Unlike feudal levies, these professional soldiers fought for pay rather than obligation. Indian city-states pioneered the use of contract armies, hiring companies of mercenaries under condottieri captains to wage their wars. These troops were often more disciplined and better trained than feudal forces, though their loyalty extended only as far as their paymasters' purses. Perhaps the most famous medieval mercenaries were the Catalan Grand Company, a formidable force of professional soldiers who fought throughout the Mediterranean world in the early 14th century. Originally formed to fight for the Byzantine emperor, they eventually carved out their own duchy in Greece after disputes over payment. Their success demonstrated both the effectiveness and the potential dangers of relying on mercenary forces. The social composition of medieval armies reflected the rigid hierarchies of medieval society itself. At the top stood the aristocratic heavy cavalry, drawn from the noble class and constituting the elite striking force of most armies. Below them were the professional men-at-arms, often of modest, gentle birth, serving as medium cavalry or dismounted knights. Next came the various infantry categories, with freemen archers and spearmen ranking above the lowest levies drawn from the peasantry. Command structures followed similar social divisions. Monarchs or great magnates typically led armies personally, with the high nobility commanding major divisions. Middle-ranking nobles led smaller contingents, while professional officers, drawn from the gentry, handled day-to-day discipline and organization. This reflected the medieval belief that military leadership was an inherent quality of noble birth, rather than a skill acquired through training. The Byzantine Empire offered a striking contrast to Western European practices. Having maintained the administrative traditions of the Roman Empire, Byzantine rulers continued to field centrally organized, professionally trained armies throughout the early medieval period. Their forces featured specialized units, standardized equipment, and sophisticated logistics far beyond contemporary Western capabilities. Byzantine military manuals like the Strategikon of Maurice provided detailed tactical instructions that had no Western equivalent until centuries later. In the Islamic world, armies evolved along different lines as well. The early Arab conquests relied on tribal warriors motivated by religious fervor and the promise of plunder. By the 10th century, however, Muslim rulers had developed sophisticated military systems based on slave soldiers known as Mamluks. These troops, primarily of Turkish or Circassian origin, received rigorous training from childhood and formed elite forces loyal to their rulers rather than to tribal or feudal connections. The Mamluk system reached its apogee in Egypt, where a military caste of former slave soldiers actually seized power in 1250 and established a dynasty that would rule until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. Unlike Western feudal troops, Mamluks were full-time professional soldiers maintained in permanent garrisons. Their effectiveness was demonstrated repeatedly against Crusader armies and Mongol invaders alike. Eastern European kingdoms developed hybrid military systems, incorporating elements from both Western and Eastern traditions. Poland and Hungary, positioned at the frontier between Latin Christendom and the Byzantine-influenced East, employed both heavy feudal cavalry and lighter, more mobile horse archers in the steppe tradition. This flexibility proved essential in conflicts with nomadic peoples like the Cumans, and later, the Mongols. Russia's military development followed a particularly distinctive path. Early Rus principalities adopted Byzantine-influenced military organizations, but Mongol conquest in the 13th century transformed Russian warfare. Under Mongol dominance, Russian armies incorporated steppe cavalry tactics and organizational structures that would distinguish them from Western European forces for centuries. By the late 13th century, England under Edward IV demonstrated how far military organization had evolved from pure feudal levies. Edward's campaigns in Wales and Scotland featured sophisticated contract systems that specified troop types, equipment standards, and payment schedules. Knights now received regular wages when their feudal service obligations expired, transforming briefly serving vassals into longer-term professional soldiers. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, 1337-1453, accelerated these trends dramatically. What began as a dynastic conflict, fought largely by feudal forces, evolved into a testbed for new military organizations. The indenture system, under which captains contracted to provide specific numbers and types of troops for set payments, became the standard method of raising armies in both kingdoms. Perhaps the most significant development of this period was the emergence of the professional man-at-arms, neither quite a traditional feudal knight nor a simple mercenary. This new type of soldier fought on horseback with knightly equipment, but served for pay rather than feudal obligation. Companies of men-at-arms formed the backbone of late medieval armies, providing both heavy shock cavalry and, increasingly, dismounted heavy infantry as battlefield tactics evolved. France's military transformation was particularly dramatic. The disasters of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt exposed the limitations of French feudal armies against more professional English forces. In response, King Charles VII established the Compagnies d'Ordonnance in 1445, Europe's first permanent standing army since the fall of Rome. These companies consisted of professional heavy cavalry, supported by archers and other troops, maintained in permanent garrison, and paid directly from royal taxes. By the end of the Middle Ages, the pure feudal levy had been abandoned almost everywhere in favor of contract troops, professional retinues, and permanent forces. This transition didn't occur uniformly or without setbacks, but the general trend was clear. The medieval world was gradually developing military systems that would eventually evolve into the standing national armies of the early modern period. Yet even as military organization became more sophisticated, medieval armies remained products of their societies. Command positions continued to be dominated by the nobility, whose martial culture and social prestige maintained their military relevance even as tactical realities changed. The common soldier gained importance on the battlefield, but social hierarchies remained firmly entrenched in military structures. The transformation of medieval armies from feudal levies to professional forces reflected broader social and economic changes. The growth of towns, expansion of trade, and development of more centralized states all contributed to new ways of raising, equipping, and maintaining military forces. What began as a system based on personal bonds and land tenure gradually evolved into one centered on money payments and contractual relationships. This evolution did not occur in isolation, but reflected interactions between different military traditions across Eurasia. Crusader states adopted elements of Byzantine and Islamic military organization. Mongol invasions transformed Eastern European armies. Italian mercenary practices influenced French and English military administration. Medieval warfare was never static but constantly adapted to new challenges and opportunities. Medieval warfare was shaped as much by its tools as by the men who wielded them. The sword stands as the iconic weapon of the medieval period, but its legendary status often overshadows a more complex reality. Far from being the universal battlefield tool depicted in popular media, swords were secondary weapons for most medieval soldiers, expensive symbols of status that saw less practical use than spears, axes, and bows. The production of a quality sword required specialized knowledge and significant resources. Contrary to romantic notions of lone blacksmiths hammering out masterpieces, medieval sword making was an industrial process involving multiple specialists. A blade might begin with an iron smelter, pass to a bladesmith for shaping, then to a grinder, a hilt maker, and finally a scabbard maker. The best European blades came from specialized production centers like Solingen in Germany and Toledo in Spain, where generations of craftsmen refined techniques for creating flexible yet durable weapons. Medieval metallurgy achieved impressive results despite limited scientific understanding. Pattern welding, in which layers of iron with different carbon contents were folded and hammered together, created blades with ideal combinations of hardness and flexibility. This technique, often misidentified as Damascus steel, produced distinctive wavy patterns visible on polished blades. By the 12th century, improved furnace technology allowed for more consistent steel production, gradually replacing pattern welding with more homogeneous blades. The iconic medieval longsword evolved considerably throughout the period. Early medieval swords were primarily single-handed cutting weapons with simple crossguards. By the 13th century, longer grips allowed for occasional two-handed use, while more complex hilts developed to protect the hand. The transition to plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries drove further evolution, with blades becoming narrower and more rigid to thrust between plates, and hilts growing more elaborate to protect the hands during close combat. For all their cultural significance, swords remained minority weapons on medieval battlefields. The spear, in various forms, was the true universal weapon of medieval warfare. Cheap to produce, requiring minimal training to use effectively in formation, and offering the crucial advantage of reach, spears armed a vast majority of infantry throughout the medieval period. A simple spear required only a wooden shaft and a small amount of iron for the head, making it affordable for even the poorest soldiers. As military technology evolved, so did the humble spear. The development of plate armor encouraged longer, heavier spear variants like pikes, which extended to 18 feet or more by the late 15th century. These weapons transformed infantry tactics, creating densely packed formations that could resist cavalry charges and control battlefield space. The evolution from simple spear to specialized pike exemplifies the constant adaptation of medieval weaponry to changing battlefield conditions. For mounted warriors, the couched lance technique revolutionized cavalry warfare. Adopted in the 11th century, this approach involved bracing a heavy spear under the arm rather than using it as a thrusting weapon. This technique transferred the kinetic energy of a charging horse directly to the spear point, creating devastating impact Special saddles with higher backs and braced stirrups developed to support this fighting style, which remained the primary cavalry shock tactic throughout the medieval period. Axes offered a cost-effective alternative to swords for many warriors. Requiring less steel and simpler forging techniques, axes delivered tremendous cutting power, especially against lightly armored opponents. The Danish axe, with its long handle and crescent-shaped blade, became particularly feared in the hands of huscarls and other elite infantry units. Smaller one-handed axes served as versatile tools in addition to weapons, making them practical choices for common soldiers. The development of ranged weapons followed equally practical paths. The self-bow, made from a single piece of wood, armed most medieval archers. These weapons required minimal materials, but considerable skill to use effectively. English and Welsh longbows represented the apex of this technology, with staves of seasoned yew reaching draw weights over 100 pounds. These powerful weapons could pierce mail armor at moderate ranges, though they remained less effective against quality plate. Crossbows offered an alternative, requiring less physical strength and training than traditional bows. By storing energy in a bent prod and releasing it mechanically, crossbows allowed relatively untrained soldiers to deliver powerful shots. This democratization of missile weapons caused significant social disruption, prompting the Second Lateran Council in 1139 to prohibit their use against Christians. The ban proved unenforceable, and crossbows became increasingly common, particularly in siege operations and among urban militias. Armor evolved in constant dialogue with weapons technology. Early medieval warriors relied primarily on mail, interlocked iron rings that provided flexible protection against cutting attacks. A complete mail shirt, or hauberk, contained up to 30,000 individual rings, each one closed by hand, representing hundreds of hours of skilled labor. This expensive protection was typically restricted to the warrior elite, with common soldiers making do with padded garments known as gambesons or simple leather protection. The 13th century witnessed the beginning of a revolutionary transition in armor technology. Small plates of iron or steel, initially attached to mail at vulnerable points, gradually expanded into complete systems of plate armor. By the early 15th century, this transition was driven by the increased prevalence of powerful missile weapons and the thrust-oriented weapons designed to defeat mail. Plate armor redirected blows, distributed impact forces, and created a smooth surface that deflected arrows and sword points alike. Contrary to popular belief, plate armor did not transform knights into helpless metal turtles. A well-made harness of plate distributed weight efficiently across the body, allowing for surprising mobility. Surviving combat treatises show armored men performing cartwheels, jumps, and ground fighting techniques. The weight of a complete harness, typically 45-55 pounds, was less restrictive than the equipment carried by modern soldiers, and was distributed more evenly across the body. The quality of armor varied dramatically based on the wearer's social status and wealth. A king or great noble might commission a harness of tempered steel from Milan's master armorers, custom fitted and decorated with gold inlay. A common man-at-arms might wear mass-produced munitions, plate of lesser quality. At the bottom of the social scale, ordinary infantry made do with partial protection, perhaps an iron cap and a brigandine, a coat with small plates riveted between layers of fabric. Medieval training for war varied as much as the equipment itself, following class divisions and changing significantly over time. Knights began their martial education early, often being sent to serve in the household of a lord or relative at age 7. Initial training focused on basic physical conditioning, horsemanship, and simple weapons handling. By adolescence, intensive combat training with increasingly realistic equipment prepared young nobles for their martial role. The quintessential knightly weapon system combined lance, sword, and horse. Training with these weapons was progressive and methodical. Young squires first learned to control mounts without weapons, then practiced hitting stationary targets from horseback, and finally engaged in controlled combat exercises with blunted weapons. Similar progression applied to ground combat, with wooden wasters replacing swords until basic techniques were mastered. Medieval combat manuscripts reveal sophisticated fighting systems far removed from the wild hack and slash portrayed in popular media. German Fechtbücher and Italian fighting treatises document comprehensive martial arts encompassing unarmed combat, dagger fighting, swordplay, and polearm techniques. These systems included precise guards, sophisticated footwork, feints, and complex tactical concepts. The 15th century master Johannes Lichtenauer's Kunst des Fechtens, Art of Fighting, covered an integrated system of combat with and without armor, on foot and horseback. The training of non-noble warriors followed different patterns. Professional men-at-arms might receive formal training similar to knights, particularly in later periods, as the distinction between social classes in military service blurred. Common infantry learned basic formations and weapon techniques through garrison service or periodic militia training. Archers developed their skills through regular practice, often mandated by law. Edward III's famous 1363 declaration required all Englishmen to practice archery on Sundays and holidays, creating a pool of skilled bowmen for royal armies. Tournaments evolved as critical training environments for the warrior elite. Early tournaments of the 12th century were barely distinguishable from actual warfare, with large groups of knights fighting over extensive terrain with minimal restrictions. These melee contests could be extraordinarily dangerous, leaving participants dead or seriously wounded. The primary purpose was explicitly military training, providing realistic combat experience in a controlled environment. By the 14th century, tournaments had evolved into more formalized and less lethal events. The joust, in which individual knights charged each other with lances along a dividing barrier, became the centerpiece of tournament culture. Specialized equipment developed specifically for these contests, including reinforced helmets and breastplates designed to deflect lances. While still dangerous, these later tournaments emphasized pageantry and individual skill display over direct military training. Tournament success became an important marker of prestige in medieval aristocratic society. Great champions like William Marshall and Ulrich von Liechtenstein built their reputations and fortunes through tournament prowess. For ambitious knights of modest means, tournaments offered opportunities for social advancement, ransoms, equipment, and patronage. These events served social and political functions beyond military training, reinforcing chivalric ideals and providing venues for diplomatic interaction. Urban militia training constituted another important tradition. Towns and cities throughout medieval Europe maintained citizen forces for defense, with training requirements specified in municipal regulations. In Italian communes, regular drills in city squares prepared citizens for both defensive operations and field campaigns. German cities organized shooting competitions for crossbowmen and handgunners, combining practical training with community festivities. These traditions laid foundations for the civic guard organizations that would evolve into later national militaries. The evolution of professional training accelerated in the later Middle Ages with the establishment of dedicated martial schools. The Company of Masters of Defense in England, the Marksbrüder and Federfechter in Germany, and similar organizations in France and Italy institutionalized combat instruction. These guilds established standardized progression systems with formal examinations and recognized ranks. Their methods emphasized practical combat effectiveness rather than the chivalric ideals that dominated aristocratic training. Battlefield effectiveness remained the ultimate test of training methods. Units with superior discipline and cohesion typically prevailed over individually skilled but disorganized opponents. The Swiss pikemen who dominated 15th century battlefields achieved their effectiveness through constant drilling in formation movements and pike handling. English longbowmen succeeded not merely through individual shooting skill, but through the discipline to maintain formation and coordinate volleys under battlefield conditions. Medical knowledge influenced training practices as well. Understanding of wound treatment improved throughout the medieval period, with specialized surgeons accompanying larger armies by the 13th century. Training increasingly incorporated protective techniques designed to minimize common battlefield injuries. Fighters learned to target gaps in armor rather than strike ineffectively against protected areas, conserving energy and increasing lethality. As warfare became more professionalized in the later Middle Ages, formal military manuals appeared to standardize training. Works like Vegetius's De Re Militari, a late Roman text that remained influential throughout the medieval period, provided templates for organizing and training troops. By the 15th century, illustrated training manuals for specific weapons became increasingly common, reflecting growing literacy among the military classes and the systematization of martial knowledge. The gunpowder revolution introduced entirely new training requirements. Early handguns and artillery pieces required specialized technical knowledge beyond traditional martial skills. Gunners needed understanding of powder mixtures, loading procedures, and maintenance techniques. By the late 15th century, artillery schools had been established in several European states, institutionalizing the transmission of these critical new skills and marking the beginning of a new chapter in military training. Training increasingly emphasized combined arms tactics as medieval warfare evolved. Knights learned to work in concert with infantry and missile troops rather than acting as independent combatants. Infantry practiced forming defensive hedgehogs of spears and pikes that could shelter archers while repelling cavalry. These integrated approaches required more complex training regimens and greater tactical sophistication from commanders and common soldiers alike. By the end of the medieval period, the romantic image of knights training primarily for individual combat had given way to more systematic preparation for coordinated warfare. The transition from feudal levies to professional forces brought corresponding changes in training methods, emphasizing discipline, unit cohesion, and specialized roles over heroic individual prowess. These changes laid foundations for the more regimented military systems that would emerge in the early modern period. Medieval battles were not the chaotic free-for-alls often portrayed in popular media. Behind the apparent disorder lay sophisticated systems of organization, command, and tactical doctrine. A medieval army, preparing for battle, followed established procedures that had evolved through centuries of combat experience. The process began well before combat, with scouts gathering intelligence about terrain and enemy movements, allowing commanders to select favorable ground when possible. Contrary to cinematic depictions, medieval commanders understood the critical importance of terrain. High ground provided both tactical advantages and better visibility for controlling troops. Water features protected flanks and channeled enemy movements. Forests could shelter reserves or enable ambushes. The selection of battlefields was rarely random, with experienced leaders maneuvering for days to secure favorable positions before committing to battle. The physical deployment of a medieval army followed recognizable patterns, with significant regional and temporal variations. The typical Western European formation placed heavy infantry and dismounted men-at-arms in the center, with cavalry on the wings and archers or other missile troops distributed where they could most effectively support the main force. This basic template could be modified based on terrain, enemy composition, and tactical objectives. Army movement relied on a standardized system of banners and standards. Each major unit carried distinctive flags identifying its leader and position in the overall formation. The royal or main commander's standard served as the Army's central reference point, with its position indicating where the greatest concentration of force should gather. Messengers constantly moved between unit leaders and the main command, carrying verbal orders and reporting developments. Sound signals provided another vital communication system in the din of battle. Different trumpet or horn calls indicated specific commands: advance, withdraw, change formation, or commit reserves. Drums maintained marching rhythm for infantry, ensuring units moved at consistent speeds. These auditory signals worked in conjunction with visual cues from banners, creating redundant communication systems that functioned even when visibility or hearing was compromised. The battle typically opened with a preliminary skirmish phase. Light infantry, mounted sergeants, and specialist missile troops engaged in probing actions to test enemy positions and responses. This phase served multiple purposes: tiring enemy horses, depleting missile supplies, forcing premature commitment of reserves, and identifying weaknesses in the opposing formation. Skilled commanders used this period to make final adjustments to their battle plans based on enemy reactions. Missile troops played crucial roles throughout medieval battles, though their specific deployment varied by period and region. Early medieval armies relied primarily on thrown weapons like javelins and Francisca axes for their opening volleys. By the High Middle Ages, specialized missile units with composite bows, crossbows, and eventually firearms delivered more sustained and lethal fire. English longbowmen famously deployed in wedge formations that maximized their field of fire while minimizing their vulnerability to enemy missiles or cavalry. The archetypal English deployment at battles like Crécy and Agincourt placed archers on the flanks in areas protected by natural features or man-made obstacles. This arrangement created killing zones where approaching enemy forces faced concentrated arrow fire from multiple directions. The effectiveness of this system depended on careful terrain selection and disciplined fire control, with archers maintaining steady rates rather than expending all their arrows in initial volleys. Continental European armies typically integrated crossbowmen with pavese shield bearers, who provided protection during the lengthy reloading process. These units deployed in more flexible formations than English longbowmen, often advancing with infantry support rather than maintaining fixed positions. Italian and Spanish crossbow units developed sophisticated rotation systems that maintained continuous fire despite individual weapons' slow reload times. Infantry formations evolved dramatically throughout the medieval period. Early medieval infantry typically formed shield walls, with men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, and spears extending forward. This simple but effective formation provided protection against cavalry and created a stable platform for close combat. Y. Similar formations appear across cultures, from Anglo-Saxon fyrd to Byzantine defensive lines, representing a universal solution to the challenges of infantry combat. The development of plate armor and polearms transformed infantry tactics in the later Middle Ages. Densely packed pike formations emerged in Switzerland and gradually spread throughout Europe, creating virtually impenetrable hedgehogs of steel-tipped wooden shafts. Unlike earlier spear formations designed primarily for defense, these pike blocks could execute offensive maneuvers, advancing in disciplined units while maintaining their protective formation. The famous Swiss pike squares of the 15th century typically deployed in three large formations: the Vorhut, vanguard, Gewalthaufen, main battle, and Nachhut, rearguard. Each formation contained thousands of men, arranged in square or rectangular blocks, with pikemen on the exterior and halberders within. This arrangement allowed them to face threats from multiple directions, while maintaining offensive capabilities. Their success against Burgundian and Habsburg forces established a tactical template that would dominate European battlefields for centuries. Italian condottieri developed counter-tactics against pike formations, creating mixed units of crossbowmen, light infantry, and dismounted men-at-arms that could engage at multiple ranges. Their flexible approach prioritized maneuver over direct confrontation, seeking to disrupt enemy formations rather than meet them head-on. This represented a sophistication of tactical thinking beyond simple formation-based approaches, acknowledging the importance of combined arms and tactical adaptability. Cavalry tactics varied significantly by region and period. Early medieval cavalry typically deployed in relatively loose formations, charging in wedge shapes that concentrated force at the point of contact while allowing individual maneuvering. Byzantine cataphracts operated in far more disciplined units, maintaining tight formation through elaborate training systems and standardized equipment. These different approaches reflected distinct military cultures and strategic requirements. The development of the couched lance technique around the 11th century transformed Western European cavalry tactics. Knights now formed in tight lines, sometimes called conrois, typically 3-5 ranks deep. This arrangement maximized the shock effect of the initial charge, while providing depth to sustain the attack. Contrary to popular depictions, these charges were not wild individual rushes, but carefully coordinated maneuvers executed at controlled speeds to maintain formation integrity. Multiple lines of cavalry provided tactical flexibility and reserve capacity. The first line aimed to create gaps in enemy formations, with subsequent waves exploiting these breakthroughs. If the initial charge failed, rear ranks could protect retreating first-line forces and launch secondary attacks. This system acknowledged the reality that cavalry charges rarely succeeded in a single action, instead requiring sustained pressure and multiple engagements to achieve decisive results. Light cavalry performed essential roles beyond direct combat. Mounted sergeants, hobelers, and similar troops screened army movements, pursued retreating enemies, raided supply lines, and collected intelligence. They typically deployed on the army's flanks or ahead of the main force, providing early warning of enemy movements and protecting the more valuable heavy cavalry from surprise. Their mobility made them particularly valuable in the chaotic later phases of battle when formations began to disintegrate. Command and control systems varied widely based on cultural context. Western European armies relied heavily on personal leadership, with commanders expected to participate directly in combat while somehow maintaining situational awareness. This approach produced heroic leadership, but often resulted in limited tactical coordination once battle was joined. The death or capture of key leaders frequently led to complete collapse, as communication networks disintegrated without their central nodes. Byzantine and Islamic armies developed more sophisticated command structures that separated tactical direction from personal combat. Generals commanded from protected positions with clear visibility of the battlefield, surrounded by signalers, messengers, and specialist administrative staff. This approach sacrificed the morale benefits of visible leadership for greater tactical control and continuity of command. The contrast between these systems highlights the different priorities and traditions that shaped medieval warfare. Unit cohesion remained the critical factor determining battlefield effectiveness across cultures and periods. Troops who maintained formation and continued to follow commands consistently outperformed individually superior warriors who lost organizational integrity. The most successful medieval commanders focused on maintaining this cohesion through training, positioning trusted veterans throughout formations, and developing clear visual and auditory control systems. The classic three-division deployment became increasingly standardized in Western European armies by the 13th century. The vanguard, main battle, and rear guard operated as semi-independent formations under designated commanders, typically great nobles or experienced knights. This arrangement distributed command responsibilities while maintaining overall coordination through the army's commander. Each division contained mixed troops types, allowing them to operate independently if separated during battle. Mongol armies operated with entirely different tactical doctrines that bewildered European opponents. Their standard deployment organized troops in decimal units 10, 100, 10,000, with each unit capable of independent action, while maintaining strict discipline within the larger force. Light horse archers would engage enemy forces in multiple feigned retreats, drawing them out of formation before heavy cavalry delivered crushing flank attacks. This system's flexibility and coordination represented a level of tactical sophistication unmatched by Western forces of the period. Battlefield communications relied on visual signals for most tactical adjustments once battle was joined. Distinctive banners indicated where units should rally or advance. Personal banners showed commanders' locations, allowing messengers to quickly find them with updates or queries. If a banner fell or moved, it could signal either disaster or tactical repositioning, sometimes leading to confusion and premature retreat. The movement of key standards thus became a critical aspect of battlefield psychology. Modern archaeological research has revealed much about the reality of medieval battle formation. Systematic excavation of sites like Toten and Visby shows distinct clusters of casualties indicating where formations held their ground until overwhelmed. These patterns confirm contemporary accounts of units maintaining cohesion even under extreme pressure. The archaeological evidence also reveals the horrific reality of medieval combat, with skeletal remains showing multiple traumatic injuries, even to fighters wearing armor. The famous longbow victory at Agincourt demonstrates how effectively combined arms tactics could overcome numerical superiority when properly executed. The English position between two woodlands created a natural funnel that compressed the larger French force, preventing them from bringing their numerical advantage to bear. Archers protected by sharpened stakes on the flanks poured arrows into the compressed French men-at-arms, while dismounted English knights formed a solid center that absorbed and repelled repeated attacks. This integration of missile fire, prepared positions, and shock troops represented the apex of medieval tactical thinking. Battle typically progressed through identifiable phases, despite variations in specific tactics. The opening skirmishing gave way to main engagement as heavy troops closed with each other. This main phase might involve multiple charges, retreats, and counterattacks, as each side sought to create or exploit breaks in enemy formations. The final phase began when one army's cohesion collapsed, typically leading to retreat and pursuit. Each phase required different tactical approaches and presented distinct challenges for commanders. Contrary to movie depictions, medieval battles rarely lasted from dawn until dusk. Most field engagements were decided within a few hours of intense fighting, with the critical action often occurring in far shorter periods. The physical demands of combat in armor meant that sustained fighting quickly exhausted even the most conditioned warriors. After the initial clashes established one side's advantage, battles typically transformed from formation fighting to pursuit and individual combats as the losing side disintegrated. The pursuit phase often proved more deadly than the main battle itself. Fleeing troops shed protective equipment to increase speed, making them vulnerable to even light attacks. Cavalry excelled in this phase, running down scattered infantry and isolated knights. Medieval accounts frequently describe far higher casualties during retreat than during the structured combat phase. This reality explains commanders' emphasis on maintaining formation even in difficult circumstances, as breaking formation often meant death during the subsequent pursuit. Casualty rates varied dramatically based on battle conditions and outcomes. In evenly matched engagements where both sides maintained good order during disengagement, losses might be limited to 10-15% of participants. When formations collapsed completely and effective pursuit occurred, the defeated force might suffer 50% or higher casualties. Knight and other elite heavy cavalry typically experienced lower casualty rates due to the protective value of their armor and the ransom incentive for capturing rather than killing high-status opponents. The composition and deployment of reserves evolved alongside other aspects of medieval tactics. Early medieval armies rarely maintained true reserves, instead committing all available forces to the initial battle line. By the 13th century, Byzantine influence and crusading experience had introduced more sophisticated approaches. Dedicated reserve forces, often under the direct command of the overall leader, waited behind the main formations, ready to exploit breakthroughs, counter enemy successes, or deliver decisive blows once the opponent was committed. Western leaders gradually recognized the command advantages of removing themselves from direct combat. By the 15th century, many commanders established fixed positions on high ground with clear visibility of the battlefield. From these positions, they could assess developments and dispatch reserves to critical areas. This evolution represents a significant shift from earlier medieval practice, where kings and great nobles led from the front, often becoming so involved in personal combat that they lost awareness of the larger tactical situation. Battlefield discipline relied heavily on unit cohesion and small group loyalty rather than abstract concepts of national or ideological commitment. Men fought primarily for their immediate companions and leaders, maintaining position because fleeing meant abandoning friends and kinsmen. The most effective units cultivated this small group identity through shared training, distinct insignia, and unified equipment. This social cohesion proved more reliable than formal discipline systems in maintaining formation under the extreme stress of medieval combat. By the late medieval period, battle tactics had reached levels of sophistication that would not be surpassed until the early modern era. The integration of missile troops, heavy infantry, and cavalry into coordinated battle plans represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution. These developments laid foundations for the larger and more complex operations that would characterize warfare after the medieval period, while still reflecting the fundamental realities of pre-industrial combat. The decisive engagements of medieval warfare rarely took place on open battlefields. For every famous encounter like Hastings or Agincourt, dozens of sieges determined the true outcome of campaigns. Control of territory ultimately meant control of fortifications, and medieval military leaders devoted far more time to capturing and defending these structures than to pitched battles. The predominance of siege warfare shaped everything from castle design to military organization, creating a sophisticated technological and tactical competition that lasted centuries. Fortifications evolved dramatically throughout the medieval period in response to changing threats. Early medieval defenses typically consisted of earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, often surrounding a wooden or simple stone tower. These structures provided adequate protection against raiders and small forces, but proved vulnerable to determined assaults and fire. By the 11th century, stone had become the standard building material for significant fortifications, offering vastly improved durability and fire resistance. The classic medieval castle emerged through generations of practical testing in warfare. The Norman motte and bailey design, featuring a raised earthen mound supporting a wooden tower alongside an enclosed courtyard, represented an early standardized fortification system that could be rapidly constructed in newly controlled territories. These structures served as bases for territorial control, visual symbols of authority, and defensive positions that could be held by relatively small garrisons against larger forces. Stone castles developed increasingly sophisticated defensive features over time. Early square keeps gave way to round towers that eliminated vulnerable corners and better deflected projectiles. Concentric designs created multiple defensive layers that had to be overcome sequentially, with each successful breach exposing attackers to fire from the next layer. Gatehouses evolved from simple entrances to elaborate defensive complexes with multiple portcullises, murder holes, and bent entrances that forced attackers through killing zones where they faced fire from multiple directions. Water features formed integral parts of many defensive systems. Moats provided obvious obstacles to direct assault, while also preventing undermining of foundations. Some fortifications incorporated controlled flooding systems that could inundate surrounding areas when under threat. In coastal locations, fortifications like the Crusader Castle Crac de Chevalier were positioned to be resupplied by sea, making complete encirclement virtually impossible and greatly extending their ability to withstand sieges. The massive stone constructions that survive today represent enormous investments of resources and technical knowledge. Building a major castle required specialized masons, carpenters, smiths, and engineers working under expert direction. Castle construction consumed substantial portions of medieval kingdoms' revenues, with major royal projects like Edward I's Welsh castles or Philip Augustus's Chateau Gaillard, representing state-of-the-art military architecture, meant to establish permanent control over disputed territory. Castle design varied regionally based on available materials, cultural traditions, and specific threats. Byzantine fortifications emphasized multiple defensive layers with sophisticated flanking systems. Middle Eastern fortifications often featured more extensive water storage and stronger protection against mining operations, reflecting the arid environment and siege techniques common in the region. Spanish castle design incorporated elements from both Christian and Islamic military architecture, creating distinctive hybrid structures during the Reconquista period. When confronting these increasingly sophisticated defenses, medieval armies developed equally complex offensive technologies. The simplest approach to taking a fortification was direct assault using ladders, but this method typically resulted in catastrophic casualties against prepared defenders. More sophisticated approaches involved siege engines designed to overcome specific defensive features, from wall-breaching machines to devices that provided protected access to defensive positions. The trebuchet represents perhaps the most iconic medieval siege engine, evolving from simpler traction-powered machines into the massive counterweight trebuchets of the 13th century. These machines operated on a simple principle: a long throwing arm with a large counterweight at one end and a sling holding the projectile at the other. When released, the counterweight's fall swung the arm upward, launching stones weighing hundreds of pounds in high arcing trajectories toward their targets. The psychological impact of trebuchets often exceeded their physical destructive power. The consistent pounding of walls created tremendous stress for defenders, with each impact potentially creating the breach that would doom the garrison. Trebuchets could also launch non-conventional projectiles, including diseased animal carcasses, severed human heads, or incendiary materials. These strategies sought to spread disease, undermine morale, or create fires within the confined spaces of the besieged fortification. Battering rams and mining operations provided more direct approaches to breaching walls. Protected galleries called cats or tortoises sheltered troops approaching walls, allowing them to deploy battering rams against gates or tunnel beneath foundations. Undermining operations would excavate beneath a section of wall, supporting the cavity temporarily with wooden props. Once complete, the props would be burned, causing the wall above to collapse. Defenders countered these tactics by listening for digging sounds and digging intercepting tunnels to attack the miners directly. Byzantine and Islamic armies developed more sophisticated incendiary weapons than their Western counterparts. Greek fire, a petroleum-based substance that continued burning even on water, could be deployed as a naval weapon or in handheld siphons during siege operations. Various forms of naphtha and other flammable mixtures added psychological terror to their physical effects, with flames that proved difficult or impossible to extinguish by conventional means. The introduction of gunpowder transformed siege warfare fundamentally, though the transition occurred gradually. Early cannon of the 14th century were dangerous to their operators and marginally effective against stone fortifications. By the mid-15th century, improved casting techniques and powder formulations had created weapons capable of breaching previously impregnable walls. The psychological impact of these early firearms often outweighed their practical effectiveness, with the noise and smoke creating fear, disproportionate to their actual destructive capability. Defensive engineering adapted to these new threats. Walls became lower and thicker, with earthen banks behind them to absorb impact. Angular bastions replaced round towers, creating platforms for defensive artillery with overlapping fields of fire. These design changes mark the transition from medieval to early modern fortification, culminating in the elaborate trace Italian star forts of the 16th century that fully incorporated defensive responses to gunpowder weapons. Siege warfare involved complex decision-making beyond the technical aspects of assault and defense. Besiegers faced difficult choices between expensive, time-consuming circumvallation that completely isolated defenders or quicker but riskier direct assaults. Relief forces complicated these calculations further, potentially catching besieging armies between the fortification's garrison and an external threat. The most effective commanders adapted their approach based on specific factors, including garrison strength, supply situations, season, and political considerations. The decision to besiege, rather than bypass a fortification, involved careful, strategic calculation. Strong points controlling critical routes or resources might justify the time and expense of a formal siege, while isolated castles could sometimes be contained by smaller forces while the main army pursued other objectives. These decisions balanced multiple factors including season, available supplies, political pressures, and broader strategic goals. Logistics dominated siege operations even more than field battles. Maintaining a large besieging force required enormous quantities of food, fodder, and materials, all of which had to be transported to the siege site and protected from both defenders and potential relief forces. The longer a siege continued, the more these logistical challenges grew, with disease and desertion frequently weakening besieging forces more effectively than enemy action. Weather and seasons influenced siege operations dramatically. Winter sieges faced additional challenges of cold, mud, and limited food supplies, but might benefit from frozen moats that eliminated water obstacles. Summer operations provided better conditions for the besiegers, but increased disease risk in crowded camps. The most successful commanders incorporated these seasonal factors into their planning, timing operations to maximize advantages and minimize difficulties created by natural conditions. Time typically favored defenders in siege situations. Well-provisioned garrisons could outlast besieging forces that struggled to maintain supply lines and camp hygiene. This reality encouraged besiegers to seek quicker resolutions through negotiation, trickery, or high-risk assaults rather than settling in for prolonged operations. The carefully calculated surrender of a fortification after a respectable defense period was often the most pragmatic outcome, preserving lives and resources on both sides. The mechanics of siege surrender followed established conventions in most of medieval Europe. Defenders might negotiate terms allowing an honorable withdrawal after demonstrating sufficient resistance. These negotiations often specified that surrender would occur if relief didn't arrive by a certain date, giving both sides clear expectations. However, garrisons that rejected surrender demands and forced besiegers to take the fortification by storm, typically received harsh treatment, with widespread killing and plundering serving as deterrents to future resistance. The Crusader states developed particularly sophisticated approaches to both siege and counter-siege operations. Castles like Crac de Chevalier incorporated lessons from Byzantine, Armenian, and Islamic military architecture alongside Western European traditions. These fortifications featured concentric defenses, sophisticated water management systems, and protected supply routes that allowed them to withstand repeated sieges by numerically superior forces. Their effectiveness demonstrated how technical knowledge transferred between military cultures, despite religious and political conflicts. Medieval military engineers often came from unexpected backgrounds. Many were clerics with mathematical training who applied geometric principles to fortification, design, and offensive machinery. Others began as master masons or carpenters whose practical construction knowledge translated well to military applications. By the later medieval period, specialized military architects emerged, who focused exclusively on fortification design and siege machinery, creating a professional engineering tradition that would expand dramatically in the gunpowder era. The construction of temporary bridges exemplifies the practical engineering challenges of medieval campaigns. Armies needed to cross rivers while maintaining formation and avoiding the vulnerability created by divided forces. Various pontoon systems using boats, barrels, or inflated animal skins supporting wooden roadways allowed armies to cross water obstacles even when permanent bridges were unavailable or destroyed. These temporary structures required considerable technical skill to design and construct under field conditions, often while under enemy observation or attack. Field fortifications played crucial roles beyond formal sieges. Armies created defensive positions using ditches, earthworks, sharpened stakes, and portable barriers called pavises. These improvised defenses transformed advantageous terrain features into formidable defensive positions, as demonstrated at Agincourt, where the English established a position with natural flank protection, enhanced by sharpened stakes to deter cavalry charges. The ability to quickly assess terrain and enhance its defensive characteristics represented an essential skill for successful commanders. Sieges created opportunities for technological experimentation that peacetime conditions rarely provided. The pressures of active operations encouraged innovation and risk-taking that might be avoided in other contexts. Many developments in mechanical engineering, metallurgy, and chemistry emerged from siege operations where immediate practical needs overcame conservative resistance to new approaches. This pattern of warfare-driven innovation continued into the early modern period and beyond, with sieges serving as catalysts for broader technological development. The psychological dimension of siege warfare often proved as important as physical action. Defenders isolated within fortifications faced not only external enemies, but internal challenges of maintaining morale, managing limited supplies, and preventing defection or betrayal. Besiegers employed various psychological tactics to undermine defender resolve, from demonstrative executions of captives to false reports about relief forces or conditions elsewhere. These psychological operations complemented physical attacks, creating comprehensive pressure designed to force surrender without the risks of direct assault. Urban sieges presented distinct challenges from castle operations. City walls enclosed much larger areas with civilian populations, creating complex social and logistical environments. Divided loyalties among townspeople could undermine defense efforts or create opportunities for betrayal. Concerns for civilian well-being often influenced defenders' decisions about surrender more than military considerations alone. These factors made urban sieges particularly complex operations, requiring sophisticated political and military calculations from commanders on both sides. Maritime technology extended siege capabilities in coastal regions. Naval forces could establish blockades that completely isolated coastal fortifications, preventing relief or resupply more effectively than land forces alone. Specialized siege vessels carried assault troops and weapons platforms directly to seaward fortification walls, attacking sections that might receive less defensive attention. The integration of naval and land operations reached particular sophistication in Byzantine and Venetian military systems, where long maritime traditions informed siege approaches. The late medieval period saw increasing standardization of siege train components. Professional armies maintained dedicated siege specialists and transport systems for the heavy equipment needed in these operations. Artillery parks included multiple gun types for different purposes, from large wall-breaching bombards to smaller anti-personnel weapons. This standardization reflected the increasingly technical nature of siege warfare and the growing professionalization of late medieval militaries. By the early 15th century, the introduction of effective gunpowder weapons created a period of significant advantage for besieging forces. Traditional stone fortifications proved vulnerable to concentrated artillery bombardment, with walls designed to resist mechanical siege engines, providing inadequate protection against cannon fire. This temporary imbalance favoring offensive operations would eventually correct as defensive architecture adapted to the new weapons. But the transitional period saw numerous previously impregnable fortifications successfully stormed after artillery breaching operations. The complex relationship between siege technology, fortification design, tactical doctrine, and strategic necessity defined much of medieval military development. Far from the simplistic image of armored knights charging across open fields, medieval warfare centered on sophisticated engineering competitions between attack and defense systems. These technical and tactical innovations laid foundations for military engineering traditions that would continue developing into the modern era, creating a direct line of professional knowledge extending from medieval siege engineers to present-day military specialists. Victory in medieval warfare belonged not just to the skilled fighter or brilliant tactician, but to the commander who could keep thousands of men fed, equipped, and healthy while on campaign. Behind every famous battle lay the unglamorous reality of logistics, the true limiting factor of medieval military operations. An army's size was determined less by the number of available warriors than by the feasible scope of its supply chain. These practical constraints shaped strategy more decisively than any tactical doctrine. The fundamental logistical challenge of medieval warfare stemmed from the limitations of pre-industrial transport and preservation technologies. Food supplies, particularly grain and fodder, constituted enormous bulk relative to their nutritional value. A mid-sized army of 10,000 men, with 3,000 horses, required approximately 15 tons of food and 9 tons of fodder daily. Transporting these quantities over medieval roads using animal-drawn wagons created enormous practical difficulties that constrained operational reach and duration. Water transport offered significant advantages over land-based supply systems. Rivers and coastlines allowed movement of bulk goods at fractions of the cost and effort required for land transport. This reality shaped campaign planning fundamentally, with the most successful commanders designing operations around waterways whenever possible. The English campaigns in France consistently prioritized control of river systems, like the Seine and Loire, precisely because they enabled sustainable logistical networks that extended operational capabilities. Medieval armies employed several distinct supply models, depending on circumstances and available infrastructure. The simplest approach involved living off the land through systematic foraging or outright plundering. Edward III's chevauchés campaigns through France deliberately devastated agricultural regions, both to sustain his army and to undermine French economic capacity. This approach required relatively low investment in transport, but limited operations to agriculturally productive regions during seasons when food was available in the field. More sophisticated operations relied on established supply bases with regular resupply convoys moving between these points and the army. This system required substantial investment in transport capacity and security for supply lines, but allowed armies to operate in less productive regions or maintain positions for extended periods. The Crusader kingdoms developed particularly advanced versions of this model, establishing coastal fortifications that functioned as supply nodes supported by Italian maritime powers. Food preservation technologies significantly influenced campaign possibilities. Grain formed the foundation of military diets precisely because it offered the best combination of nutritional density and storage durability. Bread produced at field bakeries provided the primary caloric intake for most soldiers, supplemented by dried legumes, salt meat, and local produce when available. Wealthy commanders sometimes traveled with herds of livestock that provided fresh meat, but required substantial grazing areas that restricted movement options. The seasonality of agricultural production created a distinctive rhythm for medieval warfare. Major campaigns typically launched after the spring planting season and concluded before the fall harvest. This timing allowed armies to exploit growing crops in the field while avoiding winter conditions that complicated both movement and shelter. Deviation from these seasonal patterns usually indicated either desperation or exceptional logistical capabilities, as when Edward III conducted his winter campaign of 1359–60 through France using carefully prepared supply systems. Disease presented perhaps the greatest threat to medieval armies, regularly claiming more lives than enemy action. The concentration of thousands of men with limited sanitation facilities created ideal conditions for epidemic spread. Dysentery, known tellingly as the Bloody Flux, devastated armies on campaign, while typhus, typhoid fever, and various respiratory infections flourished in crowded winter quarters. Medical understanding of these threats remained limited, though experienced commanders developed practical countermeasures like frequently moving latrines and camp locations. The most successful medieval campaigns integrated logistical planning with strategic objectives rather than treating supply as an afterthought. When Edward of I invaded Wales, he coordinated land advances with naval forces that established floating supply bases along the coast. This integrated approach allowed his army to penetrate regions that had previously repelled invasion attempts through scorched earth tactics. The carefully planned supply system neutralized the traditional Welsh advantage of operating in terrain unsuitable for conventional military logistics. Weather conditions influenced campaign planning as significantly as human factors. Muddy roads could transform routine supply movements into logistical nightmares, while drought might eliminate water sources for men and animals along planned routes. Successful commanders incorporated seasonal weather patterns into their operational planning, recognizing that autumn rains or winter freezes could halt operations more effectively than enemy resistance. This weather-conscious approach extended to timing of sieges, river crossings, and major military construction projects. Camp organization reflected both practical necessities and social hierarchies. Medieval armies typically established temporary tent cities with designated areas for different units and functions. Higher status elements occupied central positions with better access to water and resources, while lower status troops camped in peripheral areas. This arrangement mirrored social structures, but also served practical purposes, placing reliable units in critical defensive positions and distributing leadership throughout the encampment to maintain order. The movement of medieval armies required considerable organizational skill, particularly when operating in hostile territory. Marching formations balanced defensive readiness against mobility, with typical arrangements placing supply wagons and non-combatants in the center, protected by combat units on all sides. Advanced and rear guards operated at considerable distances from the main body, providing early warning of threats and preventing surprise attacks during vulnerable movement phases. These complex formations required careful staff work and experienced officers to maintain order during extended movements. Pack animals form the backbone of military transport systems, with horses, mules, and oxen serving different roles based on their characteristics. Horses offered speed, but required quality fodder and careful management. Mules provided superior endurance and sure-footedness in difficult terrain, but at lower speeds. Oxen delivered maximum pulling power for heavy siege equipment, but moved at painfully slow paces that constrained operational tempo. Balancing these different transport resources against campaign requirements represented a critical planning challenge for medieval quartermaster staff. River crossings presented particular logistical challenges that frequently determined campaign success or failure. Major rivers could delay armies for days or weeks while suitable crossing points were identified and temporary bridges constructed. The vulnerability of armies during river crossing operations made these moments particularly dangerous, with forces divided between both banks and often constrained to narrow crossing zones. Specialized engineers developed various bridging technologies to address these challenges, including pontoon systems, prefabricated bridge components, and rapid construction techniques. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241 demonstrated how alternative logistical systems could transform military capabilities. Mongol forces operated with minimal supply trains, instead maintaining large herds of horses that provided both transportation and emergency food supplies. Each warrior typically controlled 3-5 horses, rotating between them to maintain fresh mounts while allowing others to graze during movement. This system provided operational mobility far exceeding European capabilities, allowing Mongol forces to appear without warning at locations European commanders considered safely distant from known enemy positions. The Byzantine Empire maintained perhaps the most sophisticated logistical system of the medieval period, building on inherited Roman organizational structures. The Byzantine Commissariat established supply caches along anticipated campaign routes, coordinated through an elaborate bureaucratic apparatus that tracked available resources and movement requirements. This system enabled emperors like Basil II to conduct sustained campaigns in challenging regions like Bulgaria and Armenia that would have defeated less organized logistic systems. Naval logistics developed distinct characteristics from land-based operations. Ships offered superior transport capacity, but created different constraints. Medieval vessels required frequent access to fresh water sources for crews, limiting operational range between landfalls. Prevailing wind patterns dictated feasible routes and timetables, while seasonal storms established hard boundaries for naval campaigns. These natural constraints influenced naval strategy throughout the medieval period, with successful commanders working within environmental limitations rather than fighting against them. The crusading movement generated particularly complex logistical challenges, requiring sustained operations thousands of miles from European power centers. The First Crusade relied primarily on Byzantine support and living off the land, with predictably devastating effects on regions it traversed. Later crusades developed more sophisticated approaches, with dedicated fleets supporting coastal advances and purpose-built supply bases. The logistical difficulties of these distant campaigns contributed significantly to their mixed results, as even the most dedicated crusading armies faced fundamental constraints imposed by pre-industrial supply capabilities. Military payment systems evolved alongside logistical structures, with increasing monetization of warfare paralleling broader economic developments. Early medieval armies relied heavily on plunder as payment, creating discipline problems and limiting operational control. By the 14th century, regular payment systems had become standard for professional troops, requiring sophisticated financial arrangements, including loans from Italian banking houses, advanced tax collections, and complex fund transfer mechanisms. These financial structures enabled longer campaigns and better discipline, but created new vulnerabilities when payment systems failed. The increasing scale and duration of warfare during the Hundred Years' War drove significant logistical innovations. Supply bases became more permanent, developing into fortified logistics hubs that supported operations across regions. Record keeping improved dramatically, with detailed inventories and consumption projections informing planning decisions. Transport specialization increased, with dedicated wagon designs for different cargo types. These developments reflected the gradual professionalization of military organization beyond pure combat functions. Climate fluctuations significantly influenced medieval military operations over longer time scales. The medieval warm period, approximately 951,250, created agricultural surpluses that supported larger armies and more ambitious campaigns throughout Europe. The subsequent transition toward the Little Ice Age brought harsher winters, shorter growing seasons, and reduced agricultural productivity, constraining military operations in numerous ways. These long-term climate patterns formed an environmental backdrop that shaped military possibilities independent of technological or organizational developments. The Black Death of the mid-14th century transformed military logistics alongside broader society. The sudden population reduction increased labor costs while decreasing available manpower, accelerating trends toward smaller, more professional forces. Post-plague armies relied less on mass levy systems and more on long-service professionals whose improved training partially offset numerical reductions. These demographic pressures encouraged tactical innovations that maximized the effectiveness of smaller forces, including increased reliance on gunpowder weapons that required less manpower than traditional missile systems. By the late 15th century, military logistics had evolved toward recognizably modern systems in the most advanced states. Permanent supply offices maintained detailed records of resources and requirements. Standardized equipment simplified maintenance and replacement challenges. Purpose-designed military transport vehicles improved efficiency and durability. Professional quartermasters with specialized training managed increasingly complex supply chains. These developments laid foundations for the larger and more sustained military operations that would characterize early modern warfare. The evolution of medieval logistics reflected broader societal changes throughout the period. The increased monetization of the economy enabled payment-based military systems that gradually replaced feudal service obligations. Growing literacy and record-keeping sophistication improved planning capabilities and resource management. Technological developments in food preservation, wagon design, and maritime transport expanded operational possibilities. These changes did not occur uniformly across Europe, but followed distinct regional patterns that influenced military effectiveness. Throughout the medieval period, logistics remained the true limiting factor on military operations. The most brilliant tactical plan proved worthless if troops arrived exhausted or hungry. The strongest fortification fell if its supplies ran out. The largest army disintegrated if it couldn't feed itself. Understanding medieval warfare requires looking beyond dramatic battlefield moments to the unglamorous but essential systems that kept armies functioning in the field. The logistical lessons of medieval warfare continue to resonate in modern military thinking. The fundamental challenges of moving, supplying, and maintaining forces in hostile environments remain relevant despite technological changes. Medieval commanders who mastered these challenges, establishing sustainable supply chains, maintaining force health, balancing operational reach against logistical constraints, demonstrated principles that would be recognizable to military planners today. In this continuity between past and present lies perhaps the most valuable insight from studying how medieval armies actually fought. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of medieval warfare beyond the battlefield. If you've enjoyed this deeper look at how armies really operated, please hit the like button and subscribe to Insomnia History for more content that goes beyond the myths and legends. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what historical topics you'd like us to cover next. Until then, this has been Insomnia History, keeping you awake with the fascinating realities of the past.